Good morning, honourable members, and also a special word of welcome to our ministers and deputy ministers who have joined us, parliamentary staff and party caucus staff. Welcome to today's training session on artificial intelligence, elections and disinformation. This session forms part of the ongoing programme my office has arranged to build members' capacity in the 7th Parliament. I've been encouraged by the engagement in our recent sessions and value the feedback we've received on how we can tailor our offerings according to your needs and interests. Today we turn to a subject matter that is both institutional and concerns all of us individually. South Africans will vote for their local councillors in November. And while our country is well reputed in conducting free and fair elections, we cannot assume that our political activities or the elections themselves are free of risk of interference. Generative artificial intelligence has made it easier, cheaper and faster to create false and manipulated content, while our laws and the safeguards of online platforms often struggle to keep pace. I wish to draw your attention to two dimensions of this challenge. The first is personal. This technology does not remain in the realm of policy. It reaches public representatives directly. A fabricated image, a cloned voice, or a false statement can cause genuine reputational harm, invite harassment, and disrupt the work we are elected to do. That burden is not evenly shared. According to UN Women, sexualized deepfake content has risen sharply in recent years, and women, including women parliamentarians, have comprised the overwhelming majority of those targeted. This is a matter of personal dignity and safety, and it deserves our serious attention. The second dimension concerns our own responsibility. The very tools that may be turned against us are equally available to political parties, candidates, and to their supporters. We therefore have a duty to use these technologies lawfully and ethically, and to ensure that we never become a source of the manipulation we seek to guard against. Today's session will equip us to recognize manipulated content, weigh its impact on candidates, voters, and electoral integrity, and to know both the remedies of our law provides and the practical steps to take when a person or party is targeted. I'm pleased to welcome our partner institutions and their representatives, Mr. Gregor Jekke, the resident representative of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in South Africa, which is sponsoring today's session. Thank you so much. And Dr. Tobias Schonwetter, Director of the Intaka Centre for Law and Technology at the University of Cape Town. I also welcome our two presenters who you will get to know much better during the course of this morning, Ms. Tyler Pinto and Mr. Wandile Mpisi. Both are attorneys and legal engineers, and they will guide us through the material. Honourable members, this session is intended to be interactive, and I encourage you to raise your hand on the platform or use the chat function to put questions to our presenters. I will facilitate exchanges as necessary, and a short feedback survey will be shared towards the end. And I encourage you all to complete it, as it genuinely informs our planning for the future. And it's now my privilege to hand over to Mr. Jekke from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, to be followed by Dr. Tobias Schonwetter before our presenters take the floor. Mr. Jekke.
Good morning, Honourable Deputy Speaker, Honourable Members of Parliament, distinguished guests, all protocol observed. My name is Gregor Jekke, resident representative of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in South Africa. CAS is a German political foundation that promotes civic education and supports democratic institutions in more than 100 countries. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's capacity building session on artificial intelligence, elections and disinformation, delivered by the University of Cape Town's Intaka Center for Law and Technology and supported by Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. I would like to thank the Deputy Speaker for her support, our partners at the Intaka Center for their excellent cooperation, the parliamentary staff who have made this event possible, and all members of Parliament for taking part in this training. Let me start with a simple thought. I am real and speaking to you right now. Yet, if you are watching me on a screen, proving that fact is becoming increasingly difficult. That is the world we are entering. Artificial intelligence is no longer a future issue. It already shapes how we access information, communicate, learn, and make decisions. It also presents both opportunities and challenges for democratic institutions. Artificial intelligence can make institutions more efficient and improve access to information. At the same time, it raises important questions. How do we respond to misinformation? How do we proactively ensure that this technology strengthens rather than undermines trust in democracy? These questions are particularly relevant as South Africa prepares for the local government elections on 4th November. Around the world, artificial intelligence is already changing how political messages are created, distributed, and received. That is why today's workshop is so timely. I'm delighted that we will learn from two outstanding experts, Tyler Pinto and Wandile Impisi. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I encourage everyone to engage actively, ask questions, and make the most of this opportunity. Thank you, and I wish you a productive and insightful session.
I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Tobias Schonwetter.
Great, excellent, thank you. Can I just confirm, because I'm connecting online, that I'm audible? You can hear me? Good, excellent. All right, thank you from my side as well, and good morning. As you heard, my name is Tobias Schonwetter. I'm an associate professor in the law faculty at UCT, and I direct the Intaka Center for Law and Technology there. It's really great to have you here with us today, and on behalf of the Intaka Center for Law and Technology at UCT, I want to first thank you for making the time here to be with us today. And I want to also, of course, thank you, the speaker and our partners, for making today's event possible. My job really is just to welcome you, and the heavy lifting, as you already heard, will be done by Taylor and Wandile later. But let me just say a few words about the Intaka Center before we start. What we are trying to do is to do research, teaching, and outreach, and be a hub that is based at UCT, and we work at the intersection of law, technology, and society. Our name, Intaka, signals what we try to be: agile, observant, and able to move fast enough to keep up with the technologies that don't wait for the law to catch up with them, really. We do events like this with our partners like CAS, because we do believe that good technology governance starts with the people who write the rules. And we do our research not mainly for academic journals, but to help you and others to navigate these issues in practice. So here's an invitation also. If today raises any questions you want to pursue further afterwards on AI, on data, on digital regulation more broadly, please do reach out to us. We're here long after today's workshop ends. Now, as for the substance of why we're here today, South Africa, as we all know, goes to the polls for local government elections later this year. And in a way, local government really is where the trust between citizens and the state is won or lost most directly. And that makes the integrity of this election and how information flows around it a matter of real national importance. But the information environment those elections will play out in has significantly changed. And it keeps changing every day. For instance, generative AI has made it dramatically cheaper and easier to produce convincing, fabricated content, false information that spreads faster than corrections can catch up with them, and deepfakes, synthetic audio and video that can put words into a politician's mouth they never said, or images of events that never happened. We have already seen this happening in elections elsewhere, and there's absolutely no reason to think South Africa is immune here. But when voters can no longer trust their own eyes and ears, then this starts to corrode public confidence that elections depend on. This being said, I don't want to leave you with only the negative half of the picture, because the same technologies that create these risks also offer real opportunities for you in your work. AI tools can help you better analyze voter concerns, draft more efficiently, word of caution here, always double check the AI output before making it your own, monitor service delivery, and even help identify AI-generated manipulated content. So the task in front of us here is not to reject these tools, but to learn to use them well and to build the legal and institutional safeguards that let the benefits outweigh the harms. That, I think, is in a nutshell what today will be about. And I leave you with this, and I hope today gives you tools, clarity, and hopefully also a few useful contexts to take away with you. Thank you and enjoy today's proceedings. You really are in good hands.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schoenwetter. We appreciate all the kind words. But now we're going to get down to business, and I'm going to hand over to Tyler and Wandile. So the floor is yours. I'm just going to give a brief introduction that in our first session, session 1, we are going to look at what are deep fakes, misinformation versus disinformation, I think something that many of us get confused by. And then we'll have an interactive session. That is in session 1. So Tyler, over to you.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Good morning, everybody. My name is Taylor Pinto, and as mentioned, I'm an attorney who specialized in technology law before moving into the space of legal engineering. So I've got on-the-ground experience, and hopefully we are intending to make this a practical session that members can take back to their various parties and use it in their campaigns. Alongside me, I've got Wandile MPC.
Good morning, honorable members. Again, my name is Wandile MPC. Similar to Taylor, I'm an attorney, but I'm also a legal engineer. So my background is from an AI governance, risk and compliance background. And then I pivoted into data and information security. And now I find myself actually building and configuring these tools as a legal engineer. So I build AI tools for attorneys and also help implementing them in organizations. And I'm really excited about today's conversation because it's going to cover really important topics. And I'm excited to share my knowledge with the honourable members in today's call.
Thank you. Before we kick off, I think we'll just run through the agenda for the day so that everybody knows what the plan is. Starting us off strong, we've got session 1, as the Deputy Speaker mentioned, where we'll be unpacking the problem. And this is more of a technical discussion as to ground us on the way forward, to understand what the problem is. So we'll look at what is deep fakes, what is disinformation, and then, as the Deputy Speaker mentioned, we will then move into an interactive section. Following that, we'll take a brief comfort break of about 15 minutes. Following that, we'll go through section 2, which will then be unpacking the harm that can be suffered, and we'll be looking specifically at the impact on candidates, political parties, and the voter. After that, we'll do another comfort break, and then our last session for the day will be looking at the practical side of things and looking at how do you start preparing your response. So we'll look at our practical steps, a legal and institutional overview. After that, you are welcome to raise any questions, and we'll do answers there. But also, please do feel free at any point, if we lose you, if you have any questions or comments, either use the chat or raise your hand and we can engage with you directly. We will then move back over to the Deputy Speaker for our closing discussion. So with this particular session, we've got 6 objectives. Our first objective is to understand what the deepfakes are, what is misinformation, what is disinformation, and how does this differ. I think there's a lot of confusion around the two terms, and they're often used interchangeably, but they are in fact different. Next, we want to show that they are recognizing the different ways that this material can be made. As you've already heard, this is something that is easy and cheap and readily accessible to a lot of people. So we want to look at how this can be done and what this means. And then we're moving on to understanding the potential impact on candidates, political parties, voters, as well as electoral integrity in general. Objective number 4 is looking at the practical steps we can take if you have been a victim of this sort of abuse. Number 6 is to get a high-level understanding of the legal and institutional frameworks and potential remedies involved, depending on sort of the harm that you suffer. And the final objective here is to let you leave so that you've got identifiable actions that you can look at when you're drafting your response plan. And then just to set the scene, that while this is a new technology, the way that campaigning has been done has been evolving since 1994. It may have started in the beginning with door-to-door rallies and sort of local governing campaigning. It then reached televisation in 2009, and then we saw this develop even further when we went into social media in 2014. And sort of this is the next frontier in campaigning. As you will hear, there are good and bad ways that this can be used. But what we are trying to get here is to raise your awareness around it so that you are ready for this next step, because this is where we are going. We are sort of at the precipice of where we're starting to see the outcomes of this, as you'll see here from our use cases. But fear not, we are here to make you feel comfortable with the technology and equip you to handle this next hurdle.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Taylor. So for the first session, I'll be taking the wheel. And for this session, we are going to unpack and understand the problem, so defining what deepfakes are. So this session of mine is split into 3 topics. So we're going to discuss what this technology is, how it spreads, and who spreads it. And then for the second sessions, as Taylor said, we're going to be discussing the impact. And the third session would be the law and response. All right, now before I begin, I do have a video that I'm going to show you. It is a deep fake, so I have a few disclaimers that I want to put forward before I show you the video. So it's a video of the president, and none of it is real. And I'm showing it out of not to disrespect anyone, but it is a great opportunity to see the advancements of this technology. And it wasn't in relation to political campaigns, it was for a fraudulent scheme. So that's what the video is, and that's why I'm going to show it to you, so that we can kind of see how far this technology has progressed.
I'm reaching out to you with an important message. The time for change has come, and I'm pleased to inform you that we, in collaboration with Johan Rupert, have developed a unique financial program that opens a new source of income for every resident of South Africa. Invest just 4,200 Rand to secure a stable and high passive income. However, this opportunity is limited to a certain number of places. Let's be honest, it's difficult to make everyone wealthy, but those who join now are guaranteed to earn at least 250,000 Rand per month. This project has been designed by leading economists, financial experts, and technology leaders to ensure maximum profitability for your investments. I understand that any financial decision requires trust. That's why this project has received government support and safety guarantees. We have tested the system with hundreds of trial groups, and every participant has achieved real profits. We are so confident in the effectiveness of this program that we are ready to guarantee you a refund of your investment in case of failure. Registration is open for only a few days, and I urge you not to waste any time. Submit your application now and become part of our project.
All right. For those of you who are seeing a deep fake for the first time, I would like to get the feedback on what you thought that was. You can put it in the chat, as the deputy speaker had mentioned, and because this is technology that exists right now, and as you saw, there were a few flaws. I want to also see if the honorable members were able to identify the flaws that were in that. For example, the backdrop was also a glaring issue. But again, it would be really nice to see if the honorable members in the call were able to identify a few things, what they find scary about it, what's concerning, and any thoughts that they have around deepfake, because this technology exists, it's out there, and it's being used to for financial fraud. But who's to say that this very technology won't be pointed to elections at any given point? And that's, again, the purpose of this session. And yeah.
I think also an interesting comment here or question is, if we didn't tell you that this was a deep fake upfront, is this something that you would have believed on first glance? Content aside, and just looking at if this had to pop up on your screen when you were unsuspecting, is this something you'd believe? And if so, why? What are the sort of things that is your giveaway that you've picked up on that you might say, actually, this is a red flag for me? And is that something where you find yourself needing to focus a little bit more on to double check? Or is it a natural instinct that you feel that you've developed a bit further? But we can go to the chat.
Yes, we have a few comments here. The first two relate to the synchronization of the speech and the mouth. I think that is, yes, syncing voice and movement of lips. Voice was not quite that of the president, and the syncing and the eyes.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So those are excellent points out. But again, this technology is advancing at such a fast rate where in the next few months, not even years, we won't be able to distinguish what's real and what's not. And that's how quickly this technology is advancing. So this deepfake was from earlier this year, I believe. But again, at the end of this year, this technology could look completely different. And the line between what is true and what is false will get blurred really quickly. Now, this is a quote, and why I left it up here, it's a quote from the chairperson of the Electoral Commission. And again, it's just to highlight, it's more like a warning, how I interpret it as like a warning of the risks of generative AI in these hyper-localized, in these elections that are coming up. And yeah, it's a massive concern because the deepfakes are going to come up quite often. And the purpose of this session is to help you understand what this technology is, how it spreads, how to counter it. And that's what we'll be covering in this session. Now, when it comes to elections, specifically in the local elections that are coming up, again, there are thousands of candidates that are available. So the party pool of the candidates has increased significantly. So what that means now is that there's more accounts that you need to be on the lookout for. There's more content and there's more information that constituents would have to sift through to determine what is real and what is not real. And with this, there is no clear, plausible check. So for example, especially on a local level, because since there's so many candidates, it's different from a national level where there are main parties where you can identify them, you know them. But with local elections, it becomes harder. Voters can't say, oh, that doesn't sound like him. You'd never say something like that. Or even the backdrop is different. So those are things that are going to be a massive concern in these elections. And this can also impact voter turnout because the trust deficit is increasing. Now, this is the reality that we are operating in now. And what I'm going to speak about is the technology, because the video that I showed you was generated using artificial intelligence. Now, what is this technology? So artificial intelligence, a simple definition is that it's a computer or a technology or a software or a platform or simply a more simpler thing. It's an AI assistant or an assistant who thinks and learns and can perform tasks that were generally left for humans. So you can think of it as your assistant who has learned in all the information that exists in the internet and can now perform various tasks like problem solving, understanding speech, and making decisions for you if you prompt it correctly. So that's what artificial intelligence is and a simple definition of it. However, the key thing here is how this technology learns. Now, how it learns, a lot of people compare it to how you would teach a toddler. So for example, if you were to teach a toddler, oh, this is a cat, you'd show it the first image of a cat. And then the child will then go into the world identifying what a cat is. Is that a cat? And then as a parent, you'd say, no, this is not a cat. And then from there, the child will, if you showed enough pictures of a cat, the child will then understand what a cat is, and they'll be able to identify what a cat is and classify it. And then the child will start drawing pictures of that cat. And with those drawings, you'll start critiquing it a bit more. And the image starts getting better and better with each critique of that image of a cat. So that's how artificial intelligence learns. It learns through examples. So the more examples you give it, the better it can recognize the patterns in those images, in the voices, and the better it can replicate those things. And that's how you get technology like deepfake. And as it was said earlier, deepfake is a video or an image that was created using artificial intelligence. So it's meant to look like a real person or sound like a real person. Because with artificial intelligence, it's not just limited to video, it's also the sound. This technology can learn when you pause, when you speak, how your tone in your voice, how it elevates and decreases. Those are patterns in your voice. And the artificial intelligence can learn those patterns, and then it gets to a point where it can replicate that. And as the technology progresses, the accuracy also increases. Now, what does this mean? I mentioned examples of voices, of videos and images. Now, for the everyday person, this might not be a massive concern because there aren't enough examples of specific individuals that exist online. So they have a low public record. So the risk of the everyday person, the everyday South African, them being created as deepfakes is low risk. However, as public figures, where your content is constantly on radio, on videos, you're constantly doing news interviews, there's a much higher risk of you being made into a deepfake because there's just so much information about you that exists online that this technology will learn from, and it will then be in a position where it can replicate that. Now, what happens with this? It means that in your obligations to be transparent and vocalize and share issues to the public, you're also becoming a target of being deepfake because you're giving your information is readily available to the public. And with that, the more information you give, the better this technology can learn how to replicate your face, your voice, and your likeness. So that's where we are with this technology. Now, what this technology can be used for is, again, spreading disinformation. And with that disinformation, it will lead to the spread of misinformation. Now, it's important for us to distinguish between the two. So the definition of disinformation is false information spread deliberately by someone who knows it is false and does not care whether it is, and they intend to do harm. So that is what disinformation. Now, the key thing here is the intention. Again, we're looking at spreading it deliberately and to cause harm. So that's disinformation. Now, with misinformation, it is an individual who's spreading that same information unknowingly. They don't intend to spread harm, but they are now believing that disinformation, and they are spreading that information as misinformation. So that's the two distinguishing factors between that. It's the intention between you creating something falsely and spreading it versus somebody spreading it unknowing that it's not true, but they believe that it may be true. So those are the differences between the two.
An example of this, for example, is if we look at the video we've just seen of the president, the actors who created that video very clearly were doing disinformation because they knew it was fake, they knew they didn't have the president, and they also knew that he isn't promoting this particular financial product. However, if an unsuspecting person happens to stumble across this video and then shares it into their WhatsApp group on their social media, that is then misinformation because they genuinely believe that this is true information that they can now share with others. And so often disinformation is your spark, and then it goes further into your misinformation.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Taylor. All right. Now, we had spoken a lot about AI, and now I'm going to go into a deep dive into the actual technology. So, for example, the capabilities of this to spread disinformation and misinformation. So the first is voice cloning. So what this means is the software can learn a person's voice and generate audio recordings of an individual. So we have seen this a few times. So for example, that video, of our president, it could have been a voice replica and then stitched on top of a video. That's why there was no synchronization between the two. So that's one of the ways in which voice cloning can happen. And why this is important in an election perspective is that you could also generate voice notes. You can circulate, and your voters can circulate those voice notes. And the issue with voice cloning, it's much harder to detect and debunk because it's voice technology. Now with deepfakes, you can see and you can make a deduction and say, oh no, the voice is not syncing correctly. The background is a bit off. Now this identification step becomes significantly harder when it comes to voice cloning. And again, that's one of the issues that we have, or that we can face in these elections coming up, is people circulating voice notes or audio recordings of conversations that never happened at all. Okay. The next is image generation and editing. So this involves generating images of events that never happened at all. So again, let's say somebody has taken a picture of Durban, the Durban city, and they have now inserted potholes, they've inserted trash littered across. That's the capability that you can see with artificial intelligence, specifically generative AI, because what that means in an election context is that people can create videos of a specific ward and make it look as if it's dilapidated and as if the person who is in charge of that ward is not doing their job, even though that information is not accurate. So this is how the disinformation can spread, and how this technology enables those bad actors to perform such acts, to kind of discredit their opponents when it comes to elections. And why this is also extremely important is the cost, because to do this, it's extremely cheap. There's a lot of free technology that exists. So somebody who has access to an internet connection, a phone or a laptop, can easily generate images that are not true, of realities that are not true. And that can be circulated to WhatsApp groups, and it can then discredit specific candidates running in these elections. Now, the next one, which is the one that we saw, is video. As I said earlier, there are tons of videos and pictures of candidates that exist online. And again, this technology stitches all of that together. It recognizes the patterns of your face. And what it does is it generates videos now. And it's great that we had that example so that you could see its capabilities and how it actually functions in real life. So you can generate videos of events that never happened. You can generate videos of conversations that never happened, and spread, again, disinformation that way. Now, the concern here is, what would this technology, the impact it would have on the layperson, who will then pick up their phone and see a video of our president saying this? The impact is quite wide, because one, it will discredit the president if the person doesn't receive their income at the end of the day, because they invested, they saw a video of the president saying, hey, invest in this money, in this scheme, and then people invest, and that reduces the trust that they have in the president. Now, again, this technology is constantly advancing, and what we did show is an older model. There are currently more powerful models that can do a much better job at this. And this is the two examples that I showed you, the voice and the video, is what's called as deepfakes. Those are the general deepfakes that we have in the space. Now, something that is not generally considered a deepfake, but is important to note in this regard, is synthetic text at volume. So think about not newspaper articles, online news articles. So in this instance, AI has the capability of generating news articles at scale of false information or disinformation that could spread to the masses. Now, and how it sounds and how it reads, it can sound like it's a credible journalist. That's because, again, the artificial intelligence has been trained how to sound like a journalist, how to write like a journalist. So now, when it does write an article online, it sounds believable. But it could be completely fabricated. And that's the risk. So somebody can write articles or newspaper or websites based on false information that AI assisted them to generate. Now, what this could look like in the elections is, again, it's fake electoral information, which could then influence, for example, where parties or where your voters would go to vote, or who they should vote for. If somebody's doing research on a political party and then there's an AI article that is spreading false information, that is also a risk that we have to look out for. Next is bots and fake agreement. Now, a bot is a fake person or that exists online, and that's the simplest way I could describe it. Now, the risk with bots is that it generates a fake consensus or fake disagreement on a specific term. So what that means is, let's say somebody posts a picture or quotes on social media. A bad actor can deploy thousands of bots in the comment section of that post, and then it may make it look like, oh, the general public agrees with what this person is saying. But the reality is the actual humans behind, it could be just 2 or 3 people that agree with this, and the rest is just fake individuals or these bots that have been deployed in the back end. Now, what this looks like in elections is that your voice or your messages can be drowned out by these bots, and that important information would not reach your voters in this regard because, again, it's flooded with bots and comments of things to kind of distract your voters on what is actually happening and what the reality is. And that's how disinformation spreads, because if somebody sees that, oh, 50,000 people agree with what this person's saying, so it must be true. And that's how the trust gets impacted when it comes to into elections because of these bots. Now, the next section that I'm going to speak about is how it travels. So we've now covered the technology, what this technology is, how it can be used, and now I'm going to discuss how this technology travels and reaches your voters. All right. The importance of this conversation and to highlight how it travels is so that you know how to react to it. You know where this information is spread, so you'll know where to go look for it, and you'll know how to counter it if you know where to look for it. Now, there are 4 ways in which, or 4 routes in which it takes to spread this information, and we'll go into it in detail. So the first one is social media and video platforms. So this one is quite interesting because a lot of the stats that say that TikTok is the primary news, is where people get their news from now. So people have moved from the news and now look for information in video-generated content. There's approximately 29 million adults, your voters, that are on TikTok. This is where they get their information. And as we saw earlier, the videos that were generated by AI can also exist on these very platforms. So that's why social media is also a prime breeding ground for deepfakes, because a lot of people go to social media to get this information. And during election seasons, that's where a majority of the South Africans are going to look for for information on political parties. Now, if you're not keeping your hand on the pulse when it comes to how this information spreads, you won't be able to react to it on time. And timing is important, and we will touch on that a bit later. All right, the next is news sites and articles. As I said earlier, news sites and websites is where people go find this information. But what we have seen is that some websites and news articles can be generated at scale with false information. And there are a few examples. So for example, operations like Storm 1516 in Germany, they built an entire website of AI written articles designed to look like ordinary journalism. Now, what does that mean for your voters? So if they're going online to look for information on your political party, they can encounter a fake website that has false information. And that is because artificial intelligence allowed them to generate it at scale. So even if they click on the second link on Google, that could also be a fake article that was generated by artificial intelligence. And this is the world that we live in right now. So our users don't know where to get accurate information because of this technology.
I think before you move on, I think it's important to just put a little bit of context around this. So what Wandile is talking about is the generation of content, and you've heard him reference putting it on Google and how that goes. So one of the ways that Google and other platforms rank this information is by engagement, and that is why things like bots become important, because now you've got 50,000 people clicking on one particular video, and the algorithm on the back end, which is sort of the framework for how these platforms work is deciding that actually this is really important because look, we've got 50,000 people looking at this, and it then pushes it to the top. And that is one of the biggest risks we have with bots, as well as the videos, pictures, and the sites. Because what happens is when there's more engagement, that then sort of signals back to the platform that this is important content that needs to be distributed and people need to see. So now you want people looking for information, but they're getting the wrong information because other people are ranking it higher. And so you're putting your voters and the rest of the public in a very difficult situation because you're now asking them to navigate a terrain which they've never had to do before. And the ordinary South African is now being asked to look at this information and make very difficult technical decisions, because no longer is it, as you saw in the video of our president, that you can sort of see is a bit off. But if you're reading an article and you think it's a trusted source because the website looks professional, it's clean, it's got a long history, it's not something that just popped up yesterday, how do you sort of start to cross-check that if you now take that same thing and you go across to X or Facebook or to TikTok, but you're getting the same misinformation? So I think it's important here to know that one, engagement with the content drives it highest, you're more likely to find it. And secondly, that this can be coordinated so that it's a multi-pronged approach, and that no matter where you are on different platforms, you are still finding the same information, which is what makes it incredibly difficult to deal with.
Thank you for that, Taylor. All right. Another way in which this technology can travel and reach your voters is directly through the phone. So when I say this, think of it as a phone call or a robocall. So for example, there's an example where President Biden was telling voters over the phone not to go vote in their November elections. So this is the risk where this technology can replicate a voice of a president. And then it could be used to contact your voters directly and then communicate with them in either the president's voice or the president's voice in a different language so that it could reach more people, because that's also a capability that this technology has. It can translate and reach people who you would not ordinarily know how to communicate with. And again, if you're a bad actor, this could mean that you can spread disinformation. However, I know I've been speaking about doom and gloom with this technology, but this technology can also be used for good. So for example, if you are a member of parliament or you want to spread a specific message, AI does have translation capabilities which can be used to reach a broader audience. However, in the hands of a bad actor, a direct phone call from the president telling them to invest in a specific thing or not to vote for a specific party is quite concerning. And that's how the direct to the phone impact, or that's what the impact has. And now this one is also harder to keep track of, because if it's calling people directly, how would anyone else in the room know that you had that phone call unless you tell people about it? So bad actors can use direct phone calls to spread disinformation on elections through this way as well. Okay, now another one which is also quite interesting due to the rise of social media, and this one is also tied to social media, is closed groups and private messaging. So a lot of information gets shared on WhatsApp, which is encrypted messaging, and a lot of people share information through WhatsApp group chats or other platforms which are encrypted. So this, when it comes to rectifying the messaging or enforcing the law, correcting what is incorrect, it becomes much harder, because again, people will circulate information in these WhatsApp groups, and then it'll be harder for law enforcement to identify, what is actually being said about these elections. So that's also how disinformation can spread using artificial intelligence. So if somebody gets a fake article or a WhatsApp voice note and shares it onto their WhatsApp group, that would then spread to other WhatsApp groups. And then that becomes misinformation because people think it's true because artificial intelligence made it sound like it's true. So, and this one is much harder to identify and also navigate because, again, the information is encrypted and stored in private devices.
What makes this difficult is that WhatsApp is your private space. The people whose phone numbers you have you sort of know those people, so you don't expect Wandile to be sending Taylor a fake message because we sort of know each other and we have each other's number. So there you're bargaining on trust, and especially in the local context where you might have access to your ward councillors and people who are active in your community, how do you know that there's misinformation if those people, I know those people, these are not randoms on the internet who are spreading information into the void. These are people who have my phone number, they're in my phone, I can talk to them any time I want to, and now we have misinformation in this space. So there's also a higher level of trust that is being broken here because people are, their guards aren't as high. I think people can get a bit annoyed with their morning messages. So when you see the picture with the good morning and you've got your flowers, people don't really think twice about that, but that is something that they get and they don't think too much of it because it's coming from a trusted source. And in the same way, those beautiful good morning messages with the flowers and birds, you can also send things of, oh, look at this pothole that I've seen, you know, it's really difficult. And now because I know Wandile might, you know, have taken this photo, but how else do we start to combat this when we're in a trusted environment?
And it's, again, this brings up an important conversation because there are examples where there were WhatsApp elections, where again you're sharing information on the elections on a trusted WhatsApp group. So for example, I have my parents who are asking me, oh, who do we vote for? And they're asking us this information on WhatsApp. So if there was a deepfake circulating and then I share that, I'd be spreading misinformation because, and then my mother or father would believe that it's true because again, it comes from a trusted source, and she will then send that to her group chats, and then their people will send it to their group chats, and this content that is being shared is highly believable because of artificial intelligence, because it sounds like, oh, two ward candidates are colluding over manipulating the votes, for example, because it sounds believable, and now that's how this disinformation spreads, and people sharing it will then be sharing it as misinformation. So those are the things that we have to keep an eye out for, especially in these upcoming elections. Now, as I spoke earlier, the enforcement gap here is quite narrow, and that is because of the rate in which artificial intelligence or disinformation spreads, or how social media operates. So if somebody is sharing a video online, it takes 5 hours for that to circulate to a wide audience. So within those 5 audience, it only takes one bad actor to drop the seed or the spark of disinformation into social media, into the group chats. And within 5 hours, that seed will then blossom. That spark will become a fire within 5 hours, where it's reaching multiple group chats, where it's circulating on social media. Now, this is an important issue that we have to highlight because the platforms in which disinformation is being distributed on, it takes about 26 hours for them to correct this information. And by that time, all the people who have consumed this information have already left thinking, oh, this is the reality that we live in. And what the electoral code that was released a few weeks ago, there's a gap of a period of 24 hours to try and correct that. Now, what's important here is that with social media as it is right now, social media platforms like Meta have removed their mechanisms or third-party individuals to fact-check things. And they have moved to a community network where it's community guidelines and community notes which verify. Now, these people are unpaid, but they're tasked with verifying information. So it also shows that from a social media perspective, the mechanisms that were in place to protect from this disinformation and misinformation are also slowly falling through. And this is an important consideration. However, the Electoral Commission has collaborated or spoken to corporations like Google, Meta, and TikTok for media monitoring in Africa, and to make sure that they are complying with specific measures when it comes to this. However, X, formerly known as Twitter, did not sign this cooperation agreement, which is also a flag because it means that on X, on Twitter, it's where a lot of information spreads. They were not party to this. So what does that mean? All right. Next is who is using it. So we've covered the technology, we've covered how it spreads, but now let's tackle who are the actual people behind the screen. Now, this matters because it determines which avenue you take from a enforcement perspective. So is it a fraudster? Is it a joke used for political satire? Was it your voter spreading misinformation? And if you know this, who the actors were, it can help you plan a course of action in your incident response plan, because you don't want to say, oh, somebody sharing a satirical piece is, oh, it's disinformation, or they did something to you that's incorrect. So knowing who is behind that is important as well. So the first one is financial scammers, and currently this is how this technology is used. As we saw earlier, it was a video of our president who was promoting a financial scamming scheme. So these are the biggest actors right now, and how it's used currently. There was research that I saw earlier about it hasn't infiltrated the election. It has infiltrated elections, but not at a wider scale or a larger scale as financial scammers. But who's to say that with these upcoming elections, that won't be the case? They'll shift their focus from financial scheming to actually spreading disinformation in these elections. So those are the first people that you'll have to keep an eye out for. Next are domestic rivals. Now, this is where the conversation gets interesting. So if it could be political parties using this technology to discredit one another. So again, the example of the image. So somebody could say, oh, take an image of a ward, let's say any ward, and then they could take pictures and generate potholes and trash, and then say, oh, this person's not doing their job, they're not a better fit because of, look at this image. So domestic rivals could be people who you also have to look out for. But there are regulations in place that they'll have to comply with, but not everyone will comply with this. So it's something that you'll have to look out for and identify who is actually spreading this information. Next is foreign operations. So South Africa finds itself in a very interesting space geopolitically because, again, multiple things like the ICJ case. So people may have an interest in influencing these elections. So we can't disregard foreign influence or foreign operations that could use artificial intelligence, inject it into South African society to discredit these elections. But from what we have seen right now, it hasn't really been happening. But who's to say by the time November comes, this is not our reality that we exist in? So that is also something that we have to look out for. Next is opportunistics and satirists. So not every deepfake is intended to cause harm. So we've all seen videos, or I've seen videos of presidents and heads of states doing TikTok dances online. So that is a deepfake, but it's not pushing an agenda per se. So, or it's used as satire, which could be protected as freedom of political expression or freedom of speech in those instances. So by knowing who is doing what and what the intention behind them sharing that is, you'll then be able to identify the steps you need to take. Because again, if somebody is sharing a video of you doing a TikTok challenge, is that something you can take to court for example, things like defamation? Or can you rely on specific acts? Can you rely on the police force? So for example, so those are the things. So if you treat everything as an attack, you'll just spend the entirety of your election campaign responding to jokes, which can be protected in this regard. Because political parties are expected to have thicker skin when it comes to critique from the public, for example. Now, this one is the hidden actor. It's your own voters. It could be your neighbor, your parent, somebody who is unknowingly believing something, and then they're sharing it with their communities, thinking that, oh, this is what is happening, this is true. And this is one where, as political parties, you have to bear in mind what information is your voter circulating to the masses? What information have you put out there that is believable? And what information exists out there that can influence what your voters see? Because again, as Taylor pointed out, communities, people share information and there's a circle of trust there. So we have to make sure that we consider your voters in these elections, especially when it comes to disinformation and spreading that disinformation, and what are they circulating amongst themselves? Because again, this is the largest distribution network for content. All right. Now, I've said a lot of scary things or challenging things, and I'd like to hear your comments in the chat about this technology and what you've heard from this session thus far. Because there is also a counter argument to this, which again might not hold true in the next 4 months, is that again a lot of the content that we are seeing is not generally targeted towards elections, but again for fraudulent schemes. So again, there were studies done where they took political or AI-generated content, and they analyzed it to see what is real, what is not real, what is directed at political parties and elections, and what is generated or directed to everything else. And about like half of that was for politics, and then the other half was just people generating information for the sake of generating deepfakes, for example. Now, what is important here is the evidence that all this information, or all the information that I spoke about, shows is that there is a degrading information environment. So not a lot of people, again, the circle of trust gets broken down. So not a lot of people believe everything that they see. As the Deputy Speaker also mentioned earlier, harassment of individuals can also come up, and that's something that we should look out for, as well as the liar's dividend, which is a concept where if a political party says something or an individual says something, they can then turn around and say, oh, but that was AI, that wasn't me. So they'll use artificial intelligence as an excuse. And there was an example in India where this happened, where there was an audio clip of a candidate, and then fact checkers actually found out that no, it wasn't artificial intelligence or a deep fake. The candidates actually said this information. So that's what is happening. The trust circle is slowly breaking down, and what voters are expecting to do is do extra research when it comes to elections, to sift through what is real, what is not real, who is saying what, is what they are saying true. Can I trust it? Is it accurate? Where did the candidates get their information from? Because they are also could be victims of misinformation themselves. So these are all the things that we have to look at during these upcoming elections.
I think what's also interesting is if we think back to when Donald Trump first ran for the presidency and he been confronted with a particular issue, he then said fake news. And that is now caught on. And that's sort of what the liar's dividend picks up on, is you could be confronted with a real thing and you can dismiss it as fake news. And now that is a plausible answer because we have the technology that's available. So it's an easy scapegoat to throw away. But as Wandile said, if you fact check it, it can actually be proven as true. I think something else that's important in this particular conversation is the context. So data, for example, is incredibly expensive in South Africa. And so we need to look at where people are getting the information from and where access is available. So, for example, is the layperson who's maybe outside of a major city, do they have access to the internet in the same way that you and I maybe do? So if they do see a video or something, do they have access to that? And does it actually matter on the ground if they are not seeing it? The alternative here is if I saw it and I tell Wandile about it, Wandile goes about his business, I see the correction. Wandile doesn't hear the correction because I'm not chasing him and say, oh, actually, sorry, the parties have actually released a statement that's saying it's incorrect. And so I think in this conversation, we've focused a lot about the technology and social media and sort of the digital stratosphere. But I think it's also incredibly important to ground this in a South African context where internet access and access to this type of information isn't as common as in other places, for example. So I think when thinking about these things, it's important to keep that in mind, and that's also how you communicate to your voters. Because if you go to somebody who, is, I had a great-grandmother who was 97, if I go to her and I say, oh, what you saw on the news was fake, and that's a deep fake, how do you start having those conversations around that in a way that other people understand, or people who are not engaging and tech savvy, how do they understand what they're seeing and what are they being asked to do? And how do you make that road a little bit easier for them? I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat saying this is a bit dystopian. It is, and I promise we will get there. It's not as doom and gloomy. It can be used for good, but unfortunately we do have people who try to take advantage of the situation. Yeah, and that wraps us up neatly. You've got 2 minutes if there are any comments, but if not, we can go to our break.
Tala, I think there is another question here in terms of it being used by extortionists. and that these AI videos are created and they want to share it and they will share it unless you pay. So what is the kind of protection that exists on social media for this kind of thing? I don't know whether that will be dealt with in a later session.
We will get into the legality and the legal landscape a bit later, but just to respond in this case, I think what makes extortionists in this particular instance a bit interesting compared to general information or deepfakes is that you can now pinpoint who's actually asking the question. Because often the problem we have with actually holding people accountable when deepfakes go viral or videos are released is who exactly is releasing the video. Because I can't say user 502 has released this video of me, let's go prosecute them. Because you might be able to go to the police for harassment, you might be able to use the Cyber Crimes Act, you might be able to use defamation and those kind of mechanisms, but it is very difficult to pinpoint who exactly that person is. And then you throw in the elements of having a bot, and now you really don't know who's behind it. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have when using the law as a protecting tool here.
Thank you. I think we will get into that also a bit later on. Thank you very much. Honourable members, colleagues, we're now going to have a comfort break for that coffee or tea that you would like. 15 minutes, so we'll start again at 10:15 on the dot. Thank you very much. Welcome back, honourable members. It is 10:15. We now continue with the second session, and I will be handing over to Tyler.
You do, Deputy Speaker. So before the break, we heard about the technology. We looked at what it is, how it's spread, and who is using it. In this particular section, we will be looking at the impact, and so what is it, the harm that it actually causes, and to whom. So whenever we sort of start having this conversation, the big overarching question is, so what? You know, you can make these videos, you can make the audio bites and all of these things, but so what? And often the question here is, did it change the election? Did it change the outcome? And I don't think that this is the correct question to be asking, because it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to prove that because Wandile had a deep fake saying that there's potholes, therefore, you know, Party A lost the election, because you never know exactly how to draw that correlation. So when we do this kind of meeting and awareness and we have this conversation, it's important to separate that we're not looking at just the outcome, because the outcome doesn't give us the full story. So because we won't have the proof, like I said, you won't be able to say because of this video, therefore this happened and therefore the election turned out this way. The second element to this is that the harm can be deeply personal. We've heard about harassment facing different candidates. That can be devastating to them in a personal capacity. And then also, what happens is because if there's an incident, we also have an issue where trust is now broken. And how do we have that trust mended going forward when we need to think about all of these things in the back of our minds? So, for example, we will now have an awareness around these deepfakes and fake news. So when people hear something that might be a little bit uncomfortable or difficult to digest, they can easily reach for this idea that this is not true, because they have verifiable evidence of past examples where that was the particular case. So when we're looking at where the harm is experienced, we look at 4 particular groups. The first one is the candidate. As a candidate, you are putting yourself out there in the public domain and you're opening yourself up. In an ideal world, that would just mean, I am Taylor, I'm representing this is what I'd like to do for you. However, that doesn't close me off from other people attacking me. And before, that might have been candidates attacking my argument and what I'm offering and critiquing that. Then it comes to my character as to an example of, Taylor acts like this in her personal life. How can you trust her to have integrity in her public capacity when serving the country or the board? So that is where the named person sort of experiences the harm in different ways. The next is the party or the organization. You are building a lot of trust, and particularly in a country like ours where we have fought for a democracy and these parties are legacy, you don't want to ruin a reputation because of one scandal or because of one deepfake or a bit of disinformation. So there you are now looking at how to protect your organization's reputation as well as the integrity of the people who work there. I think then we can look at the voters themselves. How do I, as a voter, exercise my right with confidence, because I now need to trust other people? So the harm that I am suffering here is that I want to be an active member of the democracy and go out there, but I'm being battered and bruised from all angles with fake information. Or even if it's real information, how do I start to know what to trust and what not to trust? So the harm there is you're disempowering your voter that you worked so hard to empower in the first place. And then I think the next one is the system, which in this our context here is the election. We've worked really hard to get an electoral system that is working. We have the voting. But when things start going wrong and now people want to critique the system and you're calling into question whether the system and the electoral process is legitimate because of misinformation that is going around. So there are 4 different ways this can be attacked. Do a bit of a deep dive, and then later on we will get into the specifics and look at some case studies. And again, I'm going to preface this by saying it sounds really scary and it's doom and gloom. I promise there are positives. So like I mentioned, when you're talking about the candidates, the first and the obvious one is around your reputation. You spend your life building up to this, and when you make the decision to stand for public office, again, you're putting yourself out there knowing that all of your information is going to be out there. So now, how do you respond to that when someone attacks it with misinformation? We've got only 8% of proposed corrections are ever published. And as Wandile touched on in his section, those corrections aren't always circulated with the same level of importance or virality as the misinformation itself. So your reputation takes a knock. And how do you start to fix that? The next example there is harassment. It's no longer just online or people thinking less of you. We've seen a rise, particularly with women, where deep fake images and videos of an intimate nature are being published, and that the problem there is that then women are discouraged generally from running because that is now another issue that they've got to come across. It's another issue. So you've already sort of going into this male-dominated field, and now you're being attacked on that nature. In the US, where they had 26 Congress members, they did a bit of a study to see what deepfakes were out there. Of the 26 Congress members, they found that out of that, 25 of those were deepfakes of women. So there are cases where men have been targeted, but it's predominantly women, and it gets a bit more intense in more culturally sensitive areas. Then you've got disruption. You are spending your time now refuting and looking at how do I manage this situation, how do I respond, how do I build trust, when you could have actually spent that time focusing on getting your message out there, reaching more people. So that is what's happening there. And then as we mentioned, we've got the liar's dividend, where again, something fake happens, I say no, it didn't happen, now you don't know what's true and what's false. It's very easy to combat that. And we've had a comment about extortion. How do you as an individual start combating that here? Because that is coming to you, and you've got to bear the responsibility of that, and you're going up against an unknown actor. Whereas maybe in previous scenarios, you knew exactly who was making the accusation and you could respond directly to them. Now it's sort of just out there and you've got to respond to that. All right. Then we're looking at political parties. The first big issue here is confusion. So as a political party, you set an agenda, and this is what you're trying to campaign on. So what you're trying to communicate to people. And now you have comments from the peanut gallery, and now there's confusion because are my voters actually getting the true message, or are they getting tidbits of the different narratives that are being spun around this? And I think in South Africa we've got quite a decisive and active political sphere. This is a real threat here. We're also looking at the resources. Unfortunately, political parties have a limited number of people who can work for them and who can do these particular jobs. And again, instead of spending your time advancing your cause and focusing on that, you're now having to deploy resources into combating deepfakes and misinformation, and it's a waste of your resources. But it is unfortunately something that you have to do in this particular context, because if you don't, you're just letting it sort of fester. Then we're looking at our credibility. People might use your party to bestow credibility to themselves and to others, and say, oh, Taylor's a part of party A, and therefore what she says is true. And so now you're risking the party's credibility around their standing in the public eye. And then, as Wandile also mentioned, we've got a compliance issue that's coming out. How do you start to comply with the different things? Again, that's more of a burden on you than before.
Yeah, and I just want to touch back on the impact that it has on parties. Again, as we expressed earlier, the technology is widely accessible, and again, elections can be quite competitive. So as I showed you earlier, there are different parties at play here, and your rival political parties are also involved in this race or this dynamic that is existing, and artificial intelligence has made it so much more easier to discredit one another. So it is also part of the conversation as, okay, we are party A, how do we conduct ourselves ethically when it comes to these elections so that we don't add fuel to this flame that is spreading, which is disinformation and misinformation. So at a party level, it is also quite important. Yes, we can feel the impact if somebody, an external party has done it, but what are we as political parties doing in this case to not make an already dire situation feel much worse? So this is also something that we could use to reflect on as well, specifically in these upcoming elections, and how our actions can impact other political parties.
We've already touched on this about the voters. So the first one is suppression. So a big drive now is to get people to register and then to get people out on the day to go. But when you start spreading, we've seen information around, oh, you don't have to register to vote. Now you can't go and vote. Or you've seen things like, oh, you need an ID and a matric certificate to go and vote. And those kind of disinformation is focused on suppressing the voter turnout and people actually going. So that's really dangerous. Then we've got a deception perspective where you have endorsements put into trusted spaces and they are fake. We've seen examples of previous leaders who have passed. For example, Martin Luther King was used to circulate information. That man's been dead for a very long time. But now it looks like he's coming out and saying this is what needs to happen. And we never, again, it's a deception and you're misleading your voter, and that doesn't build voter confidence.
And just to add on this point, it could also be used to encourage voters to feel a certain way. So they could use a picture of a past leader who has passed to compare them with the new leader, so that that comparison will exist, so that they can say, oh, you are now voting for the previous ABC or Martin Luther King if you vote for this party. And people can generate images of or videos of dead political parties and say that, oh, this person would have endorsed us. And that, again, it pulls on the heartstrings of your voters. So that is also something that the deception aspect, it's important to note when it comes to that.
We've also seen that 73% of South Africans worry that they can't tell the difference between what is fake and what is not fake. As we showed you with the video, there are key things that you and I would be able to pick up. But if you're not exposed to this on the regular and it's not part of your day-to-day, how do you start to navigate that space? This is done by various fact-checking bodies. They've done the research into how this happens. So if you've got a confused voter, what happens next? So for example, I have a younger cousin and it's his first time voting, and I said, okay, let's go vote. He says to me, Taylor, I don't know politics. I don't know politics. I don't quite know what to do. Where does he go? Where does he get information? Now he's more confused. Does that confusion lead to a suppression? Does it feel like it's above him and he can't access it? And I think where we've got such a large youth, we need to get them active and we need to get them involved in this. So this kind of confusion is very difficult. And then we've also got withdrawals where the local elections, we've seen a turnout in the 2021 local elections was at 45.79%, which is the lowest. And that might seem small, but in a local context where one or two people can actually make the difference, we need to be cognizant of actually getting people to go to the polls and to make a vote, because this is a very localized, it's called the hyperlocal context that we're operating in. So that is something that we need to be aware of, that those kind of things actually matter, and we can't just afford to say, it's 104 people, just a handful of people. Those handful of people could be a defining factor in this particular election context. As we mentioned already, the institution and the election. I think in South Africa, if you look at our context, this was a hard-fought battle for us to get this vote, and you want people to go. But that doesn't stop people from questioning the legitimacy of the vote and the process, especially when you're looking at the human element of it, where people are running the stations, where votes have to be transported, where people have to count the vote. Those are impacts. And now if you start spreading disinformation around, do we trust this body? Do we trust the IEC? Why do we trust them? Why don't we trust them? Now you're calling the entire process into disrepute. So we've got monitoring systems where voter rigging. So if I make an allegation that, the ballots were stolen from ward number 4 in the Western Cape, how do we start attacking that? What does our IEC do? Then we also have an issue where our officials in this particular situation, how do you come in as an official and try to referee the scenario when public trust in your institution and the process itself has declined. What happens then? It becomes more and more difficult, and now you're delegitimizing a very legitimate organization. We've also seen that, I don't want to get too deep into this, but things can escalate. So, for example, in the US, Donald Trump came out and said, no, the election was rigged. Now you've got the storming of the Capitol. So that is just how it can go from you and I maybe having a conversation about it and people being disgruntled to a full-blown coup, which was happening in Myanmar and in Brazil, where you have people taking up arms and going to the streets because they genuinely feel that this has been rigged and they've been cheated. So that is something that is important to keep in mind about when we think about the impact on our institution and on the elections. At this point, I'm going to pause and check if there are any comments or questions before I move on to some case studies. Yep. Right. So as promised, there are some really good uses for this kind of technology. What we saw is an example in India leading up to their general elections in 2024. One of their political party members was able to deliver a speech in Hindi, and it was then translated into multiple languages in real time. So it felt like he was speaking to people in their native language. And I think in South Africa, that is a golden opportunity for us, because I, for example, if I wanted to run for office, I can only speak English, but I would want to engage people in their native tongue, and I want people to feel like I'm approachable and to build that relationship. So being able to speak to them and not just have them read a translation or have my interpreter or my translator next to me, but to hear the words coming out of my mouth in their language is incredibly powerful. And this is one of the ways that we've seen it being used. It worked really well in India and was very well received. However, from the electoral side and the authority side, they did make it known that you need to disclose this kind of thing. Yep.
Yeah.
So that's one really good example, and that's one example where we've seen political parties actually take the technology and solve a problem that they found were facing them, and then, using it for the good. This is it's a bit of an interesting one, but in Indonesia, we saw a deep fake of a deceased leader who was quite popular and well liked, and they used that particular image to create a positive narrative around a particular party. I think it's a bit of there's an ethical dilemma here, because the party obviously used it, and I think that's what's important to focus on here, is that this wasn't something done to the party or to the candidate. They used the technology in a way that they felt would advance their cause and would be good for campaigning. The ethical issue here is, firstly, this is a deceased person. What kind of rights do you have to this? Is it disrespectful to them? And who are you drawing on? And would they actually support that? And are you taking advantage and manipulating people when you start doing these kinds of things?
Yeah, and it's quite an important conversation to have, because the deceased individual can no longer speak to themselves. What if the party has progressed in such a way that they would no longer endorse that political party? So having the use of dead political parties to endorse it's again an ethical dilemma, because again that individual cannot speak for themselves, especially when it comes to elections, and the party could have evolved into something where that individual cannot recognize anymore, but they are using his likeness or their likeness to pull on the heartstrings of the voters. So what would that look like in the context of elections? Because again, there are a lot of ethical questions when it comes to this as well.
Yeah, it's also really difficult from a legal perspective, because this person is no longer with us, so how do they claim and assert their rights to not have their image used in this particular way? So that's, again, this is where a party has taken a decision to use the technology in a way that they feel benefits them. Legally, okay, sort of. Morally and ethically, gray area. And then this is also a bit of an interesting scenario. In Pakistan, one of the candidates was imprisoned during the time of campaigning, and the campaign needed to continue. And what they did is they used his voice and his speeches, and they used a deepfake to sort of show him at different events so that he could keep communicating with voters. I think this is a very unique scenario, but again, it's one of the scenarios where, again, you have a political party leading up to their campaign. They've got a problem. This is where they sort of try to solve it. Previously, this would have been the end of the campaign, because how do you start building that relationship with the public without being able to see the person? So, for example, if this person was arrested, I was imprisoned and was just writing letters, we can't verify that letter. That letter doesn't hit the same or land the same with the audience or the voter when they're unable to see it. So this is the way this was happened. And here, there's no legal issue because the person consented to being used in this particular way. This was essentially the way they wanted this to be done. And then the broader state there was again along the use of, please be aware that this is not a true video because he's in prison and you don't want to diminish the fact that he's in prison, and you sort of, in that particular way, have respect for the institution. But this is one other way that political parties have used it. So these are the three more positive, upbeat examples where political parties have taken advantage of the technology around them. I'm going to pause here again in case there are any other comments or questions. Hopefully, sure.
There are a few comments, but I think perhaps interesting here is the use of bots in public participation. So you, for example, drafting a bill and you need public participation, and now bots out there are used to influence that bill. And then there are two comments and questions about safeguards and protection, but I think that is in session 3.
Yes. So on the public participation,
there is another one apparently. Oh, okay, that is a technical one in terms of presentation. We can't read the script when the speaker is on video.
That's a meeting recorder that's tried to join that's been blocked, so that's okay.
Okay, that's a meeting recorder. Thank you.
All right, so on the bots, with most bots, it can be, it's another tax that the institution has to pay for this technology. It's great and there's all these advantages, but the downfall is that it can be used for nefarious reasons as well. And in a public participation context, that then means going to interrogate when was this account started, where was it started, and what does this mean for us? And then you need to start to document that so that should you choose to disregard that particular comment or those insights, you can then account to the public to say, you know what, we did run a full public participation process. We reviewed all of the comments. We've disregarded 10% of them because we've been able to trace them to particular bots. What's also interesting is those bots might exist, but they might be highlighting a particular issue that is valid. So it might come from Wandile and then 10 other bots follow Wandile. I think it's one of those things where you just have to be a bit more aware on how you're going to deal with this. And like I said, it's one extra thing that you now have to cater for when you are dealing with public participation.
Yeah, and again, it is an immense job because you can generate bots, like again, hundreds and thousands of bots to confirm a specific point or generate agreement on a specific point. So again, we have to ask ourselves, where should the accountability or the steps to prevent the creation of bots lie, or the verification steps sit at? Should it be at the social media companies to ensure that they are taking steps to verify specific accounts so that this bot farming is not done? Because we can verify. I mean, banks use verification systems all the time. Does that mean including an extra step when creating an account to kind of assist us in verifying what is real and what is not real? And these are questions that we'll have to have or find answers to, whether this looks, it takes the form of regulation, whether it looks like educating the masses on what a bot is and what a bot is not. But again, it's something that we have to think about. So how can we prevent the creation or mass production of these bots? But with that, on the other side is, again, bots sometimes they spread information, whether it's true or false, indiscriminately. Again, it's to generate that mass consensus on a specific matter, whether that it is true or false. So you can possibly, again, it's a tool at the end of the day, so you can possibly use them to kind of highlight a specific problem or issue. Or for example, the distribution of vaccines during COVID, bots could surface that information up. That information was considered to be good, but, and again, that's how people started engaging with it. But again, it can be used for nefarious reasons where the bots are highlighting bad things. And again, political parties and us as individuals are now put in a position where we have to question everything. We have to question public participation. We have to question the masses. And again, as we said, we live in a society where the truth now is something that we have to question.
Sure. So those are our more positive use cases. So if you are going to use that, please just keep in mind the context in which you're operating. And I will discuss it a bit later about the legal landscape and those regulations that are on you. But this was just to show that, there are positive use cases or cases where it can be used for good and not just for bad, and not just to bash candidates and bring the process down. Unfortunately, we are now going back to our previous position of the negatives. This has already been mentioned around the robocall. What happened here is leading up to the elections, there were calls that go out. So for example, we are used to receiving those in the form of direct marketing. So you have a call that goes out, and this particular call sounded exactly like President Biden. And he said, please don't vote now. Save your vote, and you can vote in the November elections, because this election is not particularly the one that I need your vote for, and you can only use it once. This was picked up quite quickly, in that it got a lot of attention very quickly, and there was strong responses from the legal and regulatory side where fines were issued and investigations were done. But the point here is they took a technology that was relatively simple. Those call centers and things are quite easy to access. A lot of political parties are already involved in that type of campaigning. Here it is just saying that this was an opposition party using that same technology against their counterparty instead of using that technology to advance their own particular narrative and their own campaign. So I think it's a very interesting way to use it there. And it speaks to how easy it is. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot quicker to get it sorted. And like Wandile said, this is again within your particular circle of trust, because in order to access me, you need my phone number. So I think that's also something that we need to look at in terms of the direct marketing space and the Consumer Protection Act and so forth. This one we've already touched on before, briefly around harassment. We had a particular candidate running for office, and leading up to the election, a deep fake was released of an intimate nature. And this then, you've got a cultural context in which you're running in terms of people who are more conservative have an issue with this. Secondly, you're now harming my individual within my integrity as to how I present in the public space. And then we're looking at basically, what do you do after this? This particular candidate chose to withdraw from the race because his reputation was significantly damaged, and how do you come back from that? And so again, this is where that same technology that was used in the Pakistani example, where somebody was in jail and needed to communicate with his voters, has been used on the other side. So again, this just displays that the technology itself may be neutral. The way that it is used is what makes the difference. So when having these conversations, we shouldn't be quick to rush and jump to the gun and say, do you know what, actually, it's the technology that's the problem. We should look at who's using it, why we're using it, and that's sort of a broader conversation that needs to happen within the political party to take a stance. To the best of my knowledge, a lot of political parties don't have an acceptable use of AI policy. And those kind of policies will set the guardrails of what is acceptable for us internally in terms of your uses, where do we draw the line, and are we open to using this kind of technology? And I think that is where we are in a space where we are more reactive than we are proactive. And that is sort of the biggest drawbacks, because what you want to do is referred to as pre-bunking, is to get it right in the beginning so that you don't wait for a scenario to happen and then try to respond to it afterwards. And then our last negative example comes from Slovakia, and this is around the harm on the institution. In this particular case, you had a candidate running, and an audio was circulated where the candidate and a journalist were said to be having a conversation around rigging the elections and how to control the media. This then spreads, and it now creates a situation where people are thinking that there is colluding happening behind the scenes between political parties and or particular people and the media. So now you're discrediting the actual institution and the process. You're discrediting the person as well as the media. So those are where people get their information from. So now, as a voter or as a member of the public, where do I turn to? I'm hearing this audio where the person I'm trying to vote for and the place that I get my information from seem to be in cahoots. And they're trying to do this because they want to rig the election. And as previously mentioned, this can go far beyond just a dinner time conversation and go into a full-blown storming or mass protests and things like that when it is used in a difficult context. What's also difficult in this particular context is how do you start tracing it? Because again, this is a voice recording. So the first issue here is you don't have your obvious clues like in videos or in images where you can say, oh, that looks a bit off because, you know, he's got 6 fingers or the lips aren't matching. You're just hearing. And because this is somebody, for example, who is campaigning, there's public images of them available. You've got them giving speeches, they're doing the campaign trail, they're smiling for all the photos, they're posting about it, they're quite active. That information is readily accessible. And as Wandile said, the more information is out there, the easier it is to train the model, the better the output will be. Then you've got a journalist, again, in the public space, a lot of information around them, maybe not about them personally, but their work and what that style would look like. So even though if you might not hear them, you might see the sort of the stylistic way they approach their writing or maybe their interviewing. And again, that then puts us in a situation where you're asking the public to do an incredibly difficult task of trying to figure out if what I'm hearing is correct. And then if you put this into the context of a heavily contested and difficult election period, what happens now? Because now every vote really does count. This is not a landslide situation where it's cut and dry, where it's like, oh, that doesn't really make a difference. Here, everybody is sort of vying for the next opportunity. So the broader risk overall is the biggest damage is once the fakes are everywhere, genuine evidence can be dismissed as fake. This is what we've touched on as being the liar's dividend, because it's difficult to say that something is true when the truth is such a vague concept at this point, because it can also be distorted in various ways. So I'm going to pause here and take if there are any comments or questions.
Yeah, I do have commentary around this. So Taylor highlighted the good and the bad of AI, and I think what is important in that conversation is that, again, this is a tool. It's a piece of technology. It is neither good nor bad. The impact that it has lies with the person using it. Now, just to, Taylor highlighted a few good examples, but there are plenty when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence. And I know for the large part of the session, it has been doom and gloom, and it has been beware. But again, the technology can help you reach out to your voters better. We saw the example of the politician reaching out to their voters in different languages. You can take it a step further. You can get data on issues that your voters have, and you can then generate an action plan that can assist you with tackling these issues. And that is because, again, artificial intelligence has been trained on a large amount of data, so it has seen plenty of action plans. It has seen plenty of things that fail or plans that fail, or even social media campaign strategies, for example. It has seen plenty of those. It has been trained on these things. And it can assist you navigating that space. But again, it's how you use that technology that is important here. And Taylor did mention around the issue of, do you have like an AI use policy that will assist you in your organization at least play in the field of the law, so that when you are using it in a way that is beneficial to your organization, but also in a manner that is lawful. So those are the considerations that you'll need to have, because again, it's good, and there's immense good that could come out of the usage of technology, because again, from an administrative perspective, a lot of the administrative burden AI can assist with that. What that means then, it'll free you up to connect with your voters in a way that you wouldn't have been able to because you're stuck behind a desk. So those are the various uses of AI in which it can help you reach out and connect to your voter base. But again, it all boils down to how we use this specific technology and whether we are responsible in using this technology. And how do we react in the event that this technology is used for malicious purposes, to again spread disinformation, which will then turn into misinformation. And these are discussions that we'll have to have internally. So from the list that I showed you earlier about the bad actors or the actors that can exist, I think we can get to a point where we're removing at least one, where it's rival political parties who are spreading disinformation about each other. And that is something, if there's like a massive consensus around how we use this technology, I think that would be a good place to also venture into. But yeah, that's my commentary.
I would like to now, if you are prepared to indulge me, to ask, based on what you've heard and based on your experiences leading up to this election, what is something that you are thinking about solving with technology? Is there something that you're taking here that you're thinking, oh, this is a problem we've had, maybe we can use the technology? Or where have you already started using this technology? I'd be interested in sort of getting that understanding. And that'll then obviously lead into our framing of our next session, which will be around the legality and the regulations around that.
Right, thank you. Tala, would you want to give members and participants a bit of time? How long do you think?
Was 5 minutes enough to
5
have
minutes?
a bit of a brainstorm around what
Good.
you have as a use case, where you think it could help you, or maybe your past experience of where you haven't used it, or maybe you could have used it better? I'd be interested in unpacking that a bit further. So if we're having 5 minutes?
Okay, let's do that 5 minutes. Could I ask members to please comment in the chat, because we have almost 130 participants. So I think it's going to be much easier if you just provide your comments in the chat, and then we'll, in 5 minutes' time, we'll reply to those. Thank you. Honourable members, let's proceed. Hopefully you had some time to think, and if you still do have any comments, questions after our session today, you are more than welcome to send them into my office, and we will make sure that Tyler and Wandile answers them, and we will then get those answers to you. Tyler, I just have a comment or a question, basically. Much of elections now is on social media, as you said earlier, and where the bots come in. So now the bots don't necessarily post the initial post, they comment. And then they create this whole idea or perception that they all support this particular post. And then you think, because the bots look so real, they have the typical names of someone who would vote for that party. How do you identify whether that is, just as a layman now, you click on the name and it just says content creator. How do you determine, but that's actually a bot? Because that's what we are now dealing with in the election.
So there are a few telltale signs, namely, again, as Taylor mentioned earlier, is when was this account created? How many followers do they have? How many posts do they have? I know those aren't accurate telltale signs, because there are people who are just observers on social media. But again, it can be quite challenging or difficult to identify who's a bot and who's not. But again, as a layman, you can use those mechanisms. So go into the account, even ask for engagement. Maybe you can type a message, see if it'll respond or not, or if somebody will respond, has it been seen, or try engaging with it. Maybe under that comment, have another comment underneath it. And these are all tips that you can try as a layman specifically, because again, the layperson won't have access to technology that can scrutinize and identify whether there's an actual person behind that. So I guess, again, when was the account created? How much engagement have they interacted in? What pictures do they have? And again, it is quite increasingly difficult to determine these things, because again, the layperson won't know this information, and that's again highlights the risks of these technologies. It generates that fake consensus. So you think you're agreeing with the masses, but the masses are fake people. Those are a few tips and tricks that you can try to use to determine, but it is a difficult exercise for a layperson.
One of the other telltale signs is if that account, for example, has been dormant and it suddenly feels very strongly about cherry blossoms, and you having cherry blossoms in this particular campaign. So you have an account that was created about a month ago or even 10 years ago, but you have no other history there, and suddenly you're just very interested in these cherry blossoms. That's also one way to pick up a bot, because you've had the page the entire time. Why suddenly do you now care about this particular issue? And why are you now deciding to leave your relatively passive social media presence and now becoming more active? Why are you suddenly engaging in comments? So it's those kind of things where people start looking at trends in terms of, if you're looking at, for example, on Twitter or X, there's no tweets happening prior to this account, or it's all about this particular thing. And what you'll also pick up is on the same language being used repeatedly. So it's like a Cape Town for cherry blossoms, Cape Town for cherry blossoms, Cape Town for cherry blossoms. And these seems like it's coming from people from all over and it's suddenly everybody saying the same thing. And then you can start to sort of piece the bit together. But fundamentally, it comes down to media literacy. And again, it's one more thing that people have to be involved with. And I think it creates a barrier to access, because if you're on social media, great. It's really easy, and you learn sort of things like, if I see Wandile posting X, I'm used to Wandile posting X, and now suddenly he's posting Y, I can be like, something's not right here. But if you're new to social media, calling out those particular instances become very, very difficult. And also, I think it's quite daunting if you're a newbie to social media and you want to start engaging. Now you don't quite know where to engage, because now you say, actually, I don't like cherry blossoms. And now you've got 5 people attacking you in the comments, and now you feel overwhelmed, and now you never want to speak in public again, because those are bots. So it's not just about driving a particular message, it's also to deter other people from engaging in a public discourse, which can make it also quite an interesting one. Do we have any use cases or ways in which you think your party or you could use this technology? If not, then we are going to head to our break a little bit early, and then we'll come back at 11:15 for our last session. And again, as mentioned, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, you're welcome to send them to the Deputy Speaker's office afterwards. The information and contact details will be shared afterwards.
Members, welcome back. We're now going to start with our session 3. That is our last session, before we will also have an opportunity for a few questions and answers, if there are any. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over back to our 2 presenters.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. So again, just to situate us, we started off with the technology and grounding what we know around how it's used, where it's used, and what it works with. Then we looked at the impact in terms of the individual, at a candidate level, the party, the organization, and the voter. And now we're going to look at the law and your response plan. So here we're looking at what to do, how fast, and what the draft code requires from you. So before I get into it, although Wandile and I are both attorneys, this is not legal advice. This is sort of just to give you an idea of what's out there and the particular avenues that you can explore and things to think about when having these conversations with your particular party or your advisors. But please do consult your actual attorneys on the matter, because nuances are important and things will differ on a case-by-case basis. So there are a couple different routes. So let's sort of get a situation going. The first thing here to understand is, as Wandile mentioned earlier, not every deepfake, misinformation, disinformation warrants a legal response. So for example, you don't want to have something that is satirical and now you're running to your attorneys to respond to it. It's a waste of resources. And that's just something to sort of be aware about when you think about the legal landscape, that just because you have it doesn't mean you necessarily need to use it, and you need to be proportional in your response. So the first option is the civil route, where here you're looking at interdicts, defamations, and privacy claims. And here it's important to know what you are trying to achieve. Why am I going to my attorney? What do I want to achieve from this? Because correcting the information and the public narrative is not going to come from your legal response. That is your response plan that is separate. So when you consider the various options, and if you do want to approach the courts, on what basis are you doing that, and what are you seeking to achieve? If you're seeking compensation and for defamation or things like that, great, that's something that you can go after. If you're seeking to correct the public record, this might not be the correct approach or the best suited approach, particularly here in the case that things move a bit slower. So as Wandile mentioned previously, those first 5 hours, that is when the impact is really at its peak. Things will spread, things will move quickly. Then you've got 24 hours window in which to correct the information, and then usually by the 26th hour, platforms will start putting up those community guidelines. If you're looking at a legal proceeding, good luck trying to get that done in 5 hours. You might only be able to brief legal counsel, and then they need to go back and do their research. What's also really difficult in prosecuting, or not prosecuting, but pursuing legal action in this regard is on what basis are your claims? Because as we've mentioned, we've got things like your bots, you've got fake accounts, people hide behind fake phone numbers all the time. How do you know who to go after and who to pursue? And is it a situation where if a particular member does something, do you go after the member? Do you go after the party? What are we doing? So that's sort of your civil options there. Then we've got a criminal aspect. So under the Cybercrimes Act, certain publications, particularly those of a more intimate nature, are criminalized, and there are different penalties there in terms of fines or imprisonment. This then would require you to go to the police and to lay a complaint as you would usually do, and then you have to hand over that process and let due process run from a prosecutorial perspective. And again, there you run into the potential issue of who's perpetrating this, what evidence is available, how do we verify it, and how long is that going to take? And do we have the capacity in South Africa to successfully prosecute a cybercrime? So those are sort of things that are there to be considered. From the electoral side is that under the electoral acts, there are various rules and regulations there, and those carry sanctions. So then you can go to the IEC and lay your complaints there and expect them to take that to the electoral court and see it go from there. On the regulatory side, these are things like the information regulator, where it's the use and spread of personal information. You could approach them. You could approach the Film and Publications Board, depending on the nature of the content, where it's spread, how it's spread, and by who. You also have the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa and the Press Council. Those are your different regulatory bodies that exist within the space that you can approach to seek relief. But again, it is important to know what you are trying to achieve when you pursue this. Then you also have protection orders that can be granted under the Harassment Act and the Cybercrimes Act. And this is if you want to protect your personal person. It is available as an option. And I think this is limited specifically to where you're being harassed and being targeted. But again, how do you, if you are on the receiving end of widespread social media backlash, you can't get a protection order against everybody. What is the right of recourse there? So oftentimes people will take a multi-prong approach in terms of you can raise a request with the regulatory body, for example, at the information regulator, if you feel that, you know what, you've produced a deep fake of me, excuse me, which means you've also then taken my personal information and processed it in a potentially unlawful way. Because on what grounds are you processing that personal information? Where did you get it? How did you treat it? Those kind of things. However, if you are a public figure, it becomes a bit murky because those images are so widely available. A simple Google image of you and like your headshots on the Parliament's website and things like that, that could be used in this kind of way. So that's a bit of a more grey area. But it's things like that that exist and that you can explore and you can use when you're seeking legal relief. Any comments from you? Sure. Then we sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of some of the applicable laws that can be used. So I've already mentioned the electoral, various electoral acts. There it's strictly prohibited of spreading false information to disrupt an election or influence the outcomes. And then we also have the new code of conduct that we are expecting to come into effect quite soon. So there you've already got existing frameworks that you can use. And while it's a developing space, the technology space is still developing, and people maybe are looking for more explicit guidelines that say, you as a political party member can't do A, B, and C using artificial intelligence. It's important to know that while we don't necessarily have all of those specifics, we do have laws that do exist, like the electoral acts, that you can then draw on to regulate this. But it's also important here is to be proactive. You should really think about this from the perspective of, if I do this, am I infringing or doing any acts that are unlawful under, for example, the Electoral Act? This is not just about what remedies do I have. It will help you find out, for example, when you set your policies internally, what are the kinds of things we need to be aware of, and how do we sort of start to solve those problems internally so that we are proactive instead of reactive, and nobody can then come to you and make an allegation that you breached this particular act because you're aware of what the act requires of you. Then we've also got the Cybercrimes Act, which criminalizes messaging, inciting or threatening violence, and non-consensual intimate images, including fabricated ones, with court takedown orders. Again, this might not be perfectly suited to the electoral context, but the law still exists and still can be applied, and you will then, in consultation with your legal practitioner, figure out whether the incident that occurred raises to the level that triggers the Cybercrimes Act, but also, again, you can use it as a guardrail to know where your line is in the sand before you or your party take any steps. I've already covered the Harassment Act, so you can ask for a protection order against online harassment, but again, it's very difficult to prove in the first place, and secondly, to serve and identify the relevant people. PAPIA is the misuse of personal information, including micro-targeting of personal sensitive data, and can be reported to the information regulator. I think it becomes a little bit more tricky when you are a public figure and information is out there, but if information of a more personal nature does come out, you do have that. The Film and Publications Board regulates harmful online content and takes public complaints about it. So if there is content about you or your party that's been released, this is some way you can also go and trigger that. You've also got copyright laws, which I think is a bit interesting as well, because it's something that a lot of people will gloss over when they think about this, in terms of what we've seen the rise of is newsroom style deepfakes. And this usually appears on your Facebook or your Twitter. So it looks like Taylor is a legitimate news anchor in a studio with the branding. There's some IP issues there around using branding and things like that that also could be used. And then you've got your common law principles. There's your defamation and your sort of, there's defamation and your criminal injuria and your interdicts and things like that. And that again is, we've established certain things that we can use and transpose across. So for example, at a common law level, you can sue for defamation, but then you also need to be aware that truth and public interest, those are defenses. So while something might sound defamatory or you might not like it, there are defenses, and that can also become a greater issue. But no single act mentions deepfakes by name. But the way I think about it is, if you start looking at the legal landscape and what we've got, you can start to piece together a pretty good image of what's allowed and what's not allowed. The difficulty here comes around enforcement and receiving access, because of the nature of this particular development, it moves quickly. It needs a rapid response, and the legal response, while available and valid, might not be the most appropriate from a resourcing perspective, reaching the intended aim, and then just the speed at which things are moving. We mentioned it earlier that you don't want to draw too much attention. I'll get deeper into this in the next section. But going to the courts is also public. So if you saw a deepfake of an intimate nature and you go to the court, that is now in the public record. It can obviously be blocked out and things like that, but that just means that your proceedings are no longer in a personal or private capacity. There is also the risk of you having that in the public record. We've had the Disinformation Code of Conduct that's been released. It was released for comment on the 30th and was commented on, comments closed on the 29th of July. It's not in effect yet, and they're reviewing the comments. But so far, what we can sort of gauge from that is that parties and candidates across all election-related communications, campaigns, online and offline, paid and unpaid, and for the whole electoral cycle, those are all the people who are expected to comply with this particular code of conduct. So any actor within the space, that is who this applies to. What it prohibits the creation and spreading of disinformation, deceptive AI and synthetic content, faking any person, fake accounts and bots, micro-targeting built and sensitive personal information. So those are the kind of things where we already see where the law is a bit slow to develop. We've got a code of conduct there that is attempting to fill this gap, and they're prohibiting certain things because they're aware of that. What it's trying to protect against, or what it's trying to protect, is legitimate criticism, satire and fair reporting, and falsely labeling real criticism as fake. Because, like I said, we live in a country where you've got the right to freedom of expression and political expression, and being on the receiving end of a critique is not justifiable under this. People are still allowed to critique you, still allowed to give you that kind of feedback. And that's sort of what we're looking at there in terms of what we're trying to protect, because you're trying to balance the rights of your person and your dignity and your integrity while also respecting the rights to freedom of speech. What it requires of those who are bound by this is to label political adverts, mark all your synthetic comments. So for example, with the video we saw earlier of the president, in the bottom left corner it says AI material. And that is the way, if you're going to use AI, you should have a mark somewhere. I'm sure there'll be contestations around what that mark should look like. If you put a tiny little thing in the top corner and it's, fades into the background, has it accurately been marked, or should it be big and bold and visible? You should also monitor your platforms, and if you find yourself in a situation where you've released disinformation or misinformation, you've got a 24-hour window to retract that. And then you've got to report it to the necessary bodies within 72 hours, and then you've got to keep a record of this and have all your accounts secured. And what this leads us to is that political parties will now need to essentially develop a specialized wing, because this is an entirely new development that's happening, and you need people who are firstly comfortable with the technology on a technical level and will be able to sort of get you the information that you need so that you can keep your records. Where did it come from? When did it start? Those kind of things. Then you need people who understand at a social level, understand what that looks like. Traditionally, these were your PR people, but as things have developed, it's more your content creators who can give you that kind of insight. And while you could use people that you exist, I think a specialist is really important in this particular context, because you've got to document and provide that kind of evidence, and having people who know and are familiar with the space will go a long way in getting that right. And then what it enforces is any contravention is a breach, subject to a sanction under the Electoral Act and then other relevant laws, and then there will be other consequences. Before I move to the response plan, are there any comments or questions here on the legal side of things?
Yes. We have one here. How can we hold Meta and other social media outlets responsible for distributing fake content and disinformation? And do these media companies have a mechanism to stop spreading content when informed of it being disinformation? So why are social media companies not held liable for distributing claims?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So as it stands, first things first, we have to find out who the actor, to hold anyone liable, we have to identify who's the person actually spreading that misinformation or disinformation. Is it actually the social media platforms, or do they just house that disinformation or that content? And then once we've identified the person, that will then determine who we hold accountable in those instances. So what we can say about social media platforms like Meta, there are mechanisms that are in place that require people who post content to say that, oh, this is sensitive content, or this is I haven't seen anything that says, oh, this is AI generated. But again, there is a partnership or an agreement between the IEC and all these media houses. I want to see how that would progress, to see how they could hold social media houses to that agreement or engagement that they have together, and how that's going to unfold in these upcoming elections. But again, the liability lies with the person who has generated that disinformation. However, there is also an additional responsibility, and the the honourable member who raised that question is correct, because let's say it's not just social media, it's the tools that actually generate this disinformation. What blockers have they put inside there to make sure that they don't generate it? Now, for example, tools like Claude has blockers in place. So you can't generate content on specific political parties. So those are some of the mechanisms that exist that try to prohibit the spread of disinformation, especially when it comes to political parties. So what we can do is make sure that these companies are actually building mechanisms to prevent this. And how we can do that is, again, through legislation, to kind of push them to actually create those mechanisms. Otherwise, we've always seen how technology unfolds. It takes time for the laws to catch up. Now, the law in certain regards has not caught up, but is in requiring certain platforms to have mechanisms to inform users whether something is AI generated, whether the end users who are actually putting out their content are complying or doing those things. It's yet to be seen. That's my 2 cents.
Sure. I think also what's important is we've seen, so we've got the laws. The laws that we do have, we can rely on to hold Meta or anybody else sort of accountable. The problem we have here is twofold. Firstly, it's extraterritorial. In terms of Meta is not a South African company. So how do I in South Africa sue a company that is US registered? And then if you go into the US, you start looking at a state level. So that is the first sort of issue in terms of how do I get my law to apply to them in a different country? Second issue is the logistics of it. How do I access Meta? For example, who do you serve the papers to? Where do you serve the papers? How do you get them to respond? So those are the logistical things, and the cost involved in that type of litigation is exorbitant. The third issue is Meta. You're welcome to do your own research on this because I'm not going to get too deep into it. But people have tried to hold Meta liable for certain things around misinformation and the way they use personal information, particularly after Trump's first successful campaign. But the problem is Meta is huge, and a lot of people don't realize how extensively Meta is embedded into our day-to-day lives. You think Meta, you think Facebook, or you think Instagram, or you think WhatsApp. It's a massive institution, and there aren't actual alternatives. So what does that right of recourse look like? Now you sue Meta, and Meta goes, okay, that's fine, here's R1 billion. Next, because they've got enough money and resources that this is a non-problem. And we've seen a lot of the tech giants operate in this way where they they budget for potential fines, and they've got insurance for these kind of things. So going after them and holding them liable, are you actually getting true accountability from them in terms of, are they going to change anything? Are you going to get the change that you're seeking? And that's why I'm saying, when you think about these things, what are you trying to achieve by going to this avenue? Because, for example, if you actually want change and accountability, you are expecting a company that is operating globally with billions of users to change the way they work. And in changing the way they work, that affects their revenue. And they've also various other reasons for why it's difficult to change. So a lot of the time, those penalties, they'll take it. And they'll take it happily because it's a drop in the bucket for what else could be going on. So again, the laws exist and you're welcome to use them and you can use them. And I don't want to give the lawyers answer and say it depends, but really it does depend. And you might be disappointed in the way that this plays out if you do pursue that option. But I would say that I would want to live in a society where things that have this much power are regulated more strictly, and we are prepared to draw a line in the sand to say, actually, if you don't comply with these regulations in my country, you don't get access to my country. In the same way we would protect against any other product being released in the country. We could apply the same standard. We've seen the European Union release the EU AI Act, and what they've done there is they've taken a product safety approach. And what I mean by that is, before you can, for example, release a car into the market to be sold, it has to be crash tested. You've got to show that, these are the safety features it has. We've tested it extensively and it works. And they're trying to take that same logic and apply it to these particular companies. And they're saying that if you as a company are going to release this particular product into our market, these are the standards that it needs to meet. If you don't meet these standards, you can't operate here. EU AI Act is still very new, so we're going to see if the bark and the bite actually match up. Because it's one thing to write this on paper and to say this is the way I think things should action. But because of how deeply entrenched Meta is in so many different industries and the economy and things like that, it's difficult to isolate them. But I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, and to sort of think, should South Africa or Africa have a similar approach to these kind of things where we say, these are our standards, if you can't meet them, you're not allowed to use it here. In the same way we would look at a product being released into the market to say, if your car hasn't been crash tested, I'm not comfortable putting that on the road because it is a safety concern to my people. And I think we've got swept up in the novelty and the excitement of it, and now we're sort of trying to play catch up around how do we regulate this. But once it's out the cage, it's very difficult to get it back. So now we've got to hope that we can sort of find a way and find our line in the sand to get that. But up until that point, we all have a personal responsibility where we work and where we interact with people to say, this is the way I'm going to conduct myself. This is what I think is acceptable. And to hold each other then to that standard, I think can go a long way, instead of accepting this massive company that is sitting continents away to set that down. It can be a bottom-up approach. It doesn't need to be top-down. So I think that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I hope that helps. There's anything else? Sure. All right, now we can move to the response plan. So as I mentioned, an incident happens, there are a number of options before you. The first option, you've got your legal route. We've explored that. I think we've covered the positives in terms of there are mechanisms you can use. We've covered the negatives in terms of it might be a bit slow, it might be expensive, and it might not get you the results you want. So that's not great. So what a response plan does is it puts the way you're going to handle this back into your control. These are things that you can actually do with your political party to claim the power back. So, as we said, why you need the plan? Things happen really quickly. You don't want to have a deep fake go live and now everybody's scrambling. What are we going to do? Who needs to make the decision? What is our approach to these kind of things? We can't start having that conversation when it happens. What you need to be doing here is getting ready for this. So that's why we're saying settle it on a quiet day. So in the same way you would, for example, do your strat planning and do your admin, have a conversation around what this plan looks like. And this plan will have 4 parts to it. The first is the people. So who decides, who speaks, who preserves the evidence, who reports, and then you need a named role for these people. So if it's Wandile who's going to speak to the public, Wandile needs to know that he's going to speak to the public. Everybody else needs to know that Wandile is going to speak to the public, and then we need a backup in case Wandile decides to take a holiday, right? And then also what we're looking at here is the different roles that people play. If I know Wandile is speaking and my job is to preserve evidence, then I know I'm only responsible for preserving evidence. But if we're not clear on who is doing what, now I think Wandile is preserving evidence. He thinks I'm preserving evidence, and in actual fact, nobody's preserving the evidence. We're all thinking we're going to get some camera time. So those are sort of the things that you need to have done beforehand. Who are your people? Who are your main actors? Who are your core team? And what are their roles and responsibilities, and how are they going to do that? The next part then is the procedure. So then how the orders move and who signs off. You need a one-page flow from the first citing to public correction. So we don't want people to improvise and get skittish under pressure. They need to know that, listen, incident happens, we gather here, quickly, internal meeting, Wandile then goes out, Wandile will do this, and actually we need Taylor to sign off before Wandile can go and speak to the public. And Taylor's the decision maker, she's the blocker, and she is our gatekeeper as to what's going to happen. And again, it's about knowing who is doing what steps we need to follow, so that everybody knows how we're going to move through this, and we don't waste any time trying to go, oh, should we first actually go and call these other people and then those people? Should we consult with them? How are we going to do this? Can I actually go and address the public? Do I have the authority to do that? Right. And then the third thing that feeds into this is to have your templates. You need a holding line. Corrections and platform reports should be drafted, and then you fill in the specifics. So you want to prepare for a worst case scenario. So you want this ready. So for example, something happens, you don't want to go, oh, what am I going to say now? You need something that says, okay, we acknowledge that this happened on X date, we are investigating it and will respond in due course. Or something to that nature, so that when these things happen, you're minimizing and you're doing as much preparation ahead of time as possible. And templates is one particular way to do that. So that could be statements, it could be, I don't know if you're going to put out particular images, those kind of things. And that's what you're looking for developing. And that's something that can be done beforehand, and you can spend research and time developing those contents in terms of where do people receive information. So for example, you're not going to go onto TikTok and post a written statement. It's not going to work. You might need a speech, or you might need to be get ready for your video templates and things like that. And then the last decision is the avenues. So we've got different platforms here. So we've got the Real 411, which is a misinformation checking organization in South Africa. You don't want to wait until there's a situation to now go and establish a contact point there. You don't want to wait until then and now suddenly you are urgent and there are 5 people in front of you. So you want to know who you need to speak to, how their procedure works, what that process looks like. Likewise for platforms, how do you flag information, and what is a community guideline, or what do the rules and regulations say for example, Facebook? Again, you don't want to wait up until the day happens and then you want to check the terms and conditions of Facebook and to say, okay, it's a violation, now what? How do I report something? Am I reporting? Am I blocking? Do I need to take this further and actually escalate it to the commercial body of Facebook and not just like the platform? And then the IEC as well. Who are the people that you're contacting? Because knowing that you must talk to somebody in the IEC is not helpful. You need to know who you need to talk to and what do they need from you to be able to take action on their side. Similarly for SAPs and your lawyer, those kind of things. Because you come to your lawyer and you say, oh, this happened to me, and they go, okay, now what? What are we seeking to achieve? Or you go to the police. Again, you want to be ready so that you can be as helpful to those people as possible so that things can move quickly. And then this is where, like as Wandile mentioned, you've got those 5 hours where things are really going viral. Then you need to respond to it. So time is of the essence here, and you don't want to waste time getting your house in order when you can get your house in order ahead of time. I think this is a pretty comprehensive approach. There are a lot more sophisticated ways that you can go about this, but I think those are your fundamentals, or these are the 4 things that you need to get right. And then a big thing here is when the plan goes live, what's important is that you don't amplify the information. Earlier we spoke about engagement and how the more engagement there is around a particular deepfake or misinformation piece, it gets ranked higher. So now there's more people looking at it, there's more eyes on it. That's not what we want. We're trying to respond to it effectively and shut it down. And the way that we do that is by going to, like I said, you have your 4 elements of your plan, you release your statement and you leave it. You can't spend the next 24 hours rebutting every single comment, because then you're just driving traffic to the issue that you're trying to bury. So if you come out and say, it's fake, we're investigating, and you leave it, and then maybe a week from now you investigate and say, actually, these are the findings of our investigation, and you can publish that if you so choose. So within this plan, you have the preserve stage. As I mentioned, that is when you are looking at gathering your evidence. So this is things like taking a screenshot of what you saw, keeping a URL or where you saw it, when you saw it, how you saw it, so that when you refer to a particular matter, you know exactly where it came from. Then you want to verify if it's fake, if it's real, and sort of what that looks like. So you might see something that seems alarming, and we've seen in our use cases where people have said it's fake and it's not fake, so you want to go and verify that information. Then you need to contain it, and this is where I'm saying you need to go and report to your various platforms, and you need to alert your relevant stakeholders. And then again, big issue here is don't reshare, don't send it further. I understand that you might have the urge to go, oh, did you see? But oh, did you see? Then oh, did you see? Oh, did you see? Now everybody's seen it, and the issue that we're trying to contain is actually you've made it worse. Then you've got a correction. So you just one calm, collected, factual statement that says, you know what, no. And also what makes the correction really powerful is if you've got a trusted source of truth. So for example, if your party has a really good up-to-date website and people know that when anything is legitimate and you want to communicate to people, you put it on your website, then you're, okay, cool, that's our source of truth. Everybody knows. So that should this be picked up by the media, they know to look at your website and say, okay, great, this is the record. They've set the record straight, this is coming directly from the source, and they don't have to guess where it's coming from. Because if you're now a little bit on Twitter, a little bit on Facebook, and then some random person's doing a radio interview, it's difficult to figure out what we're trusting and what the narrative is, because now you're spending time corroborating stories and making sure that what was said on Twitter, what was said on Facebook, and what was said on the radio are the same thing. So you want to have your trusted source of truth. You don't have to have one, but you need to have those channels so that people know what to trust. And then if it does get to a point where you do want to escalate, this is already mentioned around the different platforms and things you need to engage, you need to know where to escalate it to. Is this an IC issue? Is it a criminal issue where I need the police? Do I need my lawyers? And where does it add value? So this is sort of what we're trying to figure out here, because you don't just want to throw money at the situation. Let's try and figure out who the correct people are to escalate this to, and then to take it from there. And so the biggest thing is you want to starve this out. You want to starve it out so that you don't give it a chance to fester and to grow, because the more traction it has, the more eyes on it, the further it can develop. So something that might have been something in passing, an innocent thing of you doing a TikTok dance, now becomes a whole philosophical discussion around what does professional conduct look like for a member of parliament, when in actual fact it started off as you just dancing on the internet, or fake you dancing on the internet. So that is where things can escalate very quickly. So let's rather just bring it down and then tone it down, and with doing that your other platforms know not to rank it higher, and Google and things like that. But also it gives people little to talk about, because in 5 hours time nobody cares anymore. The internet moves on really quickly, so you can be popular for 5 minutes, and if you let it go, you wake up tomorrow and you should be fine. And then what makes the plan work? You need speed, as we've mentioned. I think we've now covered that quite in depth. You need a proportion. So if it's one person with 100 followers and they've made a joke about you, dragging them to court with a defamation lawsuit is not great. Or coming at them guns blazing is not great. It's not a good look for you either, because you need to also keep in mind how you are being perceived by the public. Because just because you can use all this force and these resources doesn't mean that you should. Because like I said, it could be one person who does that. Or if it's, for example, somebody who's known to just be a pot stirrer, they like to cause a little bit of drama, you don't have to respond to that either. Then, as mentioned, you need one voice, one source of the truth, who is going to speak for us and what are they going to say. And then your evidence by default, like I said, you got to gather those resources around your screenshots, URLs, timestamps. If you have, the more information you have, the better. So like rather too much information than too little. And then you want to rehearse this and not just walk through it, or not just have it written. So your team actually needs to know what to do. You don't want a piece of paper that sits somewhere in the office that people vaguely know about. And then a situation happens and now you want to go run for this piece of paper and nobody knows how it works. So it's to go through these kind of situations to be like, okay, what's the fire drill here? And then to make sure that your compliance is built into these plans. Like I said, you've got all these laws, regulations, codes of conduct. We can look abroad for best practices and things like that. So that can all help inform the way you draft your plan. I've presented a very simplistic view here of the core tenets, but when you start doing further research and you're looking at other things, it can be developed into a more sophisticated route. And that's the kind of things that you're looking at. And then I think what's also important is lessons learned. So an incident happens, you act according to the plan, you should bake in some time to say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, where can we improve, what do we need to do better? And that's sort of how you get this plan to keep going. So this is just your one pager. So who decides, who preserves, what the holding line is, when to escalate, who speaks, first steps, where to report, and the clock. So let's correct it in 24 hours, report it in 72 hours, and then keep our records so that should we wish to escalate it, we've got it written down, we've got it ready to go. So that is sort of the rapid response plan. And I realize it's a lot of information to take in and it's asking you to do a lot more work than maybe you would have expected because this is a new development. But I do think it's important to consider these kinds of things and to have them on your radar. So I will now pause for comments or questions.
Right. I have one here. I think this is an interesting, tricky one. Which government department should be taking the lead in regulating AI?
We've seen the Department of the DTIC leading the national policy, so I don't see why they couldn't take up this charge. But I do think, from my personal experience, that you need different people in the room. Because something that I experience from this perspective might be different to somebody else's perspective. So you need that interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach when crafting this plan, because what's important for me in the department over here might be different for you, but also our lived experiences are really important. So I think it's important to maybe have one driver in terms of they are the one driving it forward, but they are not the only ones who should be leading that conversation and having that conversation. I think that conversation should be multi-pronged and as many people as possible, and then funnel it down, because ultimately this affects people in different ways. And a top-down approach, I don't think it's going to be very effective.
And I think perhaps just linked to that, you also refer to legislation and regulation and different pieces of legislation. Would you be in favor of, like in the EU, to have an AI Act?
The tricky thing here is, so what the EU AI Act has done is they've gone with a principle-based approach. So that means they've agreed that these are the, let's say, 5 things that are really important from a principle perspective, and that is what they're going to use to drive their response. And I think that's a nice approach because things move so quickly. 10 years ago, deepfakes didn't exist in this way. So it might take us 2 years to get an act that's been passed through Parliament, it's been signed, that's now in effect. And then you need to build the infrastructure around that. And then the technology changes in 6 months. Now you've got this act that you spent all the time, money, and resources on, and it's not really responding to the current need. So I think, on one hand, it could be helpful, but also don't discount the laws and what we have. We've got a really, really brilliant legal system or legislative development that you can put together. The question Wandile and I get quite often is, do you need a specific law? And generally it's like, if you had to draw Venn diagrams and you put them up and you put the Constitution in the middle, generally you can figure out what's allowed and what's not allowed. So while the law might be helpful in terms of people then can't hide and say, oh, I didn't know, because there is a specific law on it. If you are acting in good faith and you engage the laws that we already have, you can figure out where the boundaries are. There obviously will be gray areas, but there will always be gray areas. But the risk is the legal process and drafting and getting laws passed it's slow, it's laborious, and then the technology changes at a drop of a hat. And so it's very, very difficult to draft specific laws to respond to specific things, because what you wanted to respond to right now will be different in 10 years' time. And then to amend that legislation as well becomes a whole other process, and now you're playing catch up. So I would say use what you have, engage with your technology developers, get an understanding of where they're going, and then see how you would sort of put regulatory frameworks in place there.
And then another one, and as we are now dealing with our members of parliament, are you, either of you, aware of any parliaments as organizations that have been affected by disinformation?
There's many. So if you look at 2024, we had probably the biggest election year worldwide with so many people, and that's where our case studies came from. So that is one place you can look to in terms of how other parliaments have dealt with it. Some of them deal with it at a regulatory level, some deal with it at a legal level. We've also had issues where the moratorium, or that blackout period where people can't respond, and that they found that actually is when people strike the best. So for example, with our Slovakia example, that was released within the 48 hours just before the elections, and there is a media blackout. What happens now? So if you're looking for really good resources, anything around the 2024 campaigns, you'll find a lot of information there around how AI has impacted elections, how it has changed things, how it has shifted things, and the overarching issue with analyzing and evaluating those outcomes is that it's difficult to say that, oh, because this call happened and because this deepfake happened, the election went in X direction. Because then you're trading into things of conspiracy theories, and there might be truth or it might not be truth, but I think that detracts from what you're trying to achieve here. I think we're trying to develop a more robust approach and a way that we can protect our mechanisms that we do have.
Thank you. Those are the only ones that I have here in the chat. So I think that, Wandile, any further comments from your side?
Yeah, so what we've seen in the space, and on Taylor's point, there are a lot of use cases or examples on how artificial intelligence or disinformation has impacted political parties specifically. But one thing that I have seen or research that has surfaced is the EISA, as I mentioned earlier, found that yes, the technology is there, and currently the focus that it has is around fraud claims and scams. It hasn't yet gotten to a point where we can say that it is swinging an entire election, or the impact is that great that now voters have lost complete distrust in political parties or the members of parliament. And that's something that we should consider. However, just because that is not heavily the case right now, it doesn't mean that it will be the same in a few months. Because again, the rate that this technology is developing in and how much disinformation is circulating or can circulate specifically around the time of elections, it is important for us to navigate with caution and also have these plans in place, the incident response plan, so that if it does get to the point where disinformation can impact elections, we have mechanisms in place to counter it, specifically when it comes to artificial intelligence. And that's why an incident response plan and general consensus amongst political parties is important, so that we don't, again, add fuel to the flame of disinformation. So that's my point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh. I think the last thing here is that while I think Wandile and I spent your morning probably putting a little bit of fear in your hearts, we don't do it from a place of fear-mongering. We do it from a place of, you've got a real opportunity here. The way you choose to respond to this and the precedent you set here sets us up for the future. So if there's even an informal consensus that this is the way we are going to treat one another in an election campaign, this is what is acceptable, this is not what's acceptable, I think it'll go a long way, and you don't have to wait for there to be a formal response from an institution. You're working with people at the end of the day. People want to know that they can trust you, and the way that they trust you is through the way that you conduct yourself. So I think with all this information, don't wait up until Parliament passes laws and now you know how to act, or the IEC releases a code of conduct. You can sit within your political parties, you can sit within your caucuses and make those kind of decisions now. And then hopefully we don't have any bad responses. I think Wandile and I have tried to cover the ways in which you can use technology, and we do hope that people do use technology, and we hope they use it in a positive way. If you use it in a bad way, I'm going to blame Wandile for that. Please don't say Taylor said I can use deepfakes because it's good for campaigning. That's not what we're trying to do here. So yeah, as mentioned, if you have any other comments or questions that you'd like to chat to us, maybe offline or once you've had a chance to review the material and have a think through it, you can send that through to the Office of the Deputy Speaker, and then we'll get back to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And also just honourable members and colleagues, a kind reminder that even whilst I'm speaking, I won't mind that you do complete the feedback so that we can get your ideas, your remarks, and that is for us improving and really addressing your needs in terms of training and capacity building. But with that, honourable members, colleagues, we have now reached the end of a very insightful training session. To the honourable members and parliamentary and party caucus staff members who joined us this morning, thank you very much. And as usual, the parliamentary programme had multiple events scheduled this morning. It was quite busy at Parliament, but many of you set time aside to log on. And I really have to stress that your attendance and participation definitely enriched our session. And again, please just complete that very short survey so that we do have the necessary feedback. But honourable members, colleagues, I think it is very clear from what we've heard from Tyler and Wandile this morning is that technology is having a profound effect on how we do politics and how we will be doing politics in the future, how we conduct elections and what we perceive as truth and what can be trusted. And I think that is one of the critical things. And especially for us in political office, AI and AI-generated content carry very serious implications, both at institutional and individual levels. So today we have learned how quickly this type of content can be created and spread, and how much damage it can cause once it is posted online. And this, of course, gives us and our political parties much to consider as campaigning for the local government election intensifies over the next few weeks, particularly because AI-enabled disinformation can undermine electoral integrity, public trust, as we've heard, and the credibility of our democratic institutions. But I want to sincerely thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for collaborating with my office and sponsoring this event for Parliament. And I also wish to acknowledge the Intaka Centre for Law and Technology at the University of Cape Town for its partnership in convening this session. Your generosity and contributions reflect a genuine commitment to strengthening our democratic institutions and multi-party democracy. And it does not go unnoticed. Thank you so much. So on behalf of the South African National Assembly, I really want to extend my thanks to you. I also want to thank our technical team, because you haven't seen them today, but we have a whole technical set up here, so thank you very much. It really went without a glitch. And then to our skilled presenters, Tyler Pinto and Wandile Mpise, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for all the preparation that went into it. Thank you for your expert and very professional presentation today. I think you really tried to make a very complex, scary topic more accessible. So it is something that is affecting our whole society, It affects our legal framework. We've touched on that, and the roles and the responsibilities of political parties and public representatives when we are considering the use of AI. And then, of course, very important, what you also focused on towards the end, the steps we can take if we do fall victim to harmful and misleading content. And I think it was very important, this last part, where you gave us those practical steps of what we now have to go and do, the time reaction we have to do, what not to do. So thank you very much for that. So in closing, I encourage all our participants to verify content carefully before believing it, respond responsibly when harming material emerges. And please, honourable members, colleagues, use what you have learned today to strengthen democratic discourse during the election period. And just a reminder again, any questions, queries, if you want a recording of this training session today, please write to my office, and that is deputyspeaker@parliament.gov.za. And with that, thank you very, very much. And everyone, enjoy the long weekend.